Invicta, a name that strikes fear into the heart of watch collectors, sharp intakes of breath, gasps of horror. But it wasn't always that way. Invicta is in fact, or was in fact, a Swiss watch manufacturer before the name was purchased by an American company to knock out hideous, bulky, blingy, oversized, nasty watches. And back in the day, like many companies, Invicta produced some beautiful watches using movements from the well-known Swiss movement manufacturers and casing them up and styling them accordingly themselves. Now this is a case in point. This is a late 40s, early 50s Invicta chronograph with a 30-minute subdial or sub-register, and it uses a Valjoux 22 column wheel chronograph movement. Here we're uncasing the movement in readiness for a service. You note there that it had a short screw and a long screw for the casing. It's important that these go back in the right place. They will only fit accordingly in their relevant slots. The front bezel pops off and the movement is removed from the front after unscrewing and removing the stem, and the start-stop pusher, like the lander on 48s and otherwise, actually remains attached to the movement, while the reset pusher in this case is separate and stays in the case, or it is actually removed from the case as you see here, but it doesn't come away with the movement, rather, is what I mean. So that's all removed in readiness for cleaning the case. The stem is refitted to allow me to align the hands for hand removal, and then hand removal just goes as is usually the case by aligning them using a poly bag to protect the dial and using hand levers to lift the hands away. We then begin disassembly of the chronograph movement itself. And I start here by removing the minute recorder jumper spring. I like to get these out of the way as early as possible on vintage chronograph movements because they are very much in the way of you moving around the movement, and they are always very, very fragile. It's an incredibly thin spring with not a lot of tension, and they are easily broken. So I like to remove them and get them out of the way as quickly as possible. The next thing to do is to identify and begin moving the various return springs and jumper springs of the chronograph movement. The tension needs to be removed from the springs before the components themselves are removed, and as with chronographs that I've stripped previously, you'll note that what I was doing there was replacing the securing screws. On the back of these vintage Swiss chronographs there are a wide variety of screws in terms of screw sizes, screw widths, shouldered or non-shouldered, and so on, and it's an incredibly confusing array of screws. And I find the easiest way to keep track of them is to remove the components and to refit the screws wherever possible so that you know exactly where it comes from and where it goes back. Likewise here, I've removed the chronograph bridge and I'm refitting the chronograph bridge screw. And here we have another spring. There are several of these on this particular movement, and they are very elaborately shaped, very unique, and removal needs to be a careful process to avoid damaging them. The reset hammer, as you can see, simply lifts away from its pivot post, like so. This is not screwed down. And here I'm removing the chronograph runner and the minute recorder runner. Here I'm removing the coupling clutch mechanism, which will be further disassembled once removed from the movement. As with all chronographs, it's a good idea to inspect and identify the eccentric adjusters prior to undoing any screws, because of course if eccentric adjusters are moved even a fraction during disassembly, things are going to be misaligned and require adjustment on reassembly. It's not a particularly difficult process, but you will need patience, time and good magnification to do it. And there we see the second part of the coupling clutch mechanism, and there you see me fighting to get a screw back into place to replace it in the bridge. Next for removal is the driving wheel from the extended fourth wheel pivot. There are special tools for this job. I do prefer, where possible, to use my hand levers. I feel like I have more control over the placement and the pressure, whereas the Valjoux tool, which looks like a Presto tool, while it is very good, it is susceptible to forces, to sideways forces, and it is very important that the wheel is lifted as straight up as is possible to avoid bending the fourth wheel pivot. And once again we have another tension spring, and the securing screw for that is refitted. Unfortunately, I don't have the technical document to hand, so I cannot give you the exact names of each of these parts. So my apologies for that. The very large screw there, rather than being a securing screw, simply serves as a retaining screw to retain the lever from the start-stop to actuate the column wheel or pillar wheel. And here we have a particularly reluctant spring, and again care must be taken when removing these. They are a very unique shape and they are essential to the operation of the movement, and so it's very, very important to remove them carefully to avoid damaging them. This part here is the brake for the chronograph runner, and in the stop position that actually drops into one of the castellations of the pillar wheel and prevents the chronograph runner from rotating. Here we have two very, very similar return springs side by side, tension springs, and it's important that you make a note of which goes where and that they are refitted correctly. And you'll see that while very similar in look, there is a slight difference to the curve of the tip of the spring. This piece here is the intermediate wheel between the chronograph wheel and the minute recording wheel, and sits on a pivot and just lifts away, similar to the reset hammer. The start-stop section has two pieces, this very end piece which pivots on a screw and hooks into the gears of the pillar wheel or column wheel and pulls it around, and that piece is removed first just for the simplicity of having it fixed in place on the movement rather than removing the whole thing and then having to do that separately on the bench. Where possible, I like to strip everything down to its very smallest component to ensure thorough cleaning. The only exception to this being the replacement, as already mentioned, of the screws in the chronograph movement, simply because it would be very, very hard to keep track of them all individually. And there you saw the start-stop extended lever and the reset lever, which sits on a post underneath, removed. The final piece of the chronograph components to be removed is the pillar wheel itself. There is one more part of the chronograph works remaining, although it's not something I look at as part of the chronograph works. It is the tension spring for the chronograph runner, which provides a small amount of upward tension on the chronograph runner. All chronographs have one of these of some description. On the vintage chronographs, they have a tendency to look like hands. Just there, you will have seen, hopefully, that there's some notable wear on the barrel arbor. And here we're just looking at the jewels and inspecting the pivots and the jewels to see what kind of condition they're in. You can just see in the top right hand corner of your screen just now the barrel arbor, and you can see, hopefully, you can see that there is some very, very noticeable ovaling and wear and play on that. There are two ways to adjust and correct for this. The old-fashioned way is to use a staking set with a domed punch to spread the material and then to broach it out with a smoothing broach. And the modern accepted future-proofing method, as it were, would be to actually remount this particular section and to bush it with a jewel, and provided that jewel isn't cracked or broken, that will essentially outlast the rest of the movement, and any wear that occurs from that point on would be in the barrel arbor rather than on the plate. Here I'm removing the bridge screws, and you can see there that the lengths differ slightly, and again it's important to note where these differ and how they go back together. Similar to many other vintage chronographs, the fourth wheel and escape wheel are under a separate bridge, which is being removed here. Typically, I would advise that you once again check the screw lengths. I just happen to know that on this particular bridge they're the same length, so it doesn't matter. But if it's a movement that you're unfamiliar with, I always recommend that you take the screws out and place them in an order that you know, so that you know which holes they came from, and to take note of whether they differ in length at all. So there you'll notice I was removing the cannon pinion, which I ordinarily would do first and had completely forgotten to do. And you'll also note that I didn't have any footage of my removing the hands and dial, but the process for that is very, very similar to the Landeron video, the 48 videos that you will have seen if you've been watching my channel. And the dial feet are locked by eccentric screws from the rear of the movement, which you can just see on either side of the movement there. There you can see I've moved the train of wheels and the ratchet wheel and the mainspring barrel. Here we're looking at the barrel and train bridge and removing the ratchet wheel, the winding pinion, crown wheel even. I knew we'd get there eventually. This is of the type that's retained by a central plate with 2 small screws, and this one really put up a fight. I've actually cut out some footage of lots of gentle prying and levering, because this one was well and truly stuck to that plate, despite it looking relatively clean, much to my surprise. And it took quite a bit of persuasion to get that to be removed. And here I'm removing the click and the click spring. And then back onto the dial side for removal of the keyless works and the dial side train. The keyless works are something of an unusual setup on this particular watch, in that every part of it is held by a screw and every part is separate, unusually so. Where you would normally have things such as the yoke on a pivot post, and you would have a setting lever which is typically larger and would cover most of the keyless works. In this particular one, you'll see the setting lever spring is a small separate component held by a screw, which is just being removed here. Very, very similar in design and idea to the return springs on the chronograph movement itself, but a good, nice, solid and well-made part. The setting lever at this point will just lift out. That of course is held by a screw from the rear, which you saw me removing. And then the yoke is also held by its own screw, which is a shouldered screw, and the yoke spring is also held by a shouldered screw. It's almost as if in the Valjoux factory that day somebody had milled out the plate and realised that they had forgotten to put the posts in to sit everything on, or had run out of posts, so decided to just fit screws to everything instead. It does work, and it works very well, however. And as a final step, as is ordinarily the case, we refit the balance in preparation for the base movement and all of the parts to be put into the cleaning machine and run through a cleaning cycle in readiness for reassembly. And once I have run this video through the encoder, I shall be editing the rebuild series of videos and getting that ready so that I can upload them within a relatively quick succession. These are some that I'd forgotten I'd filmed, and they've been sitting in my folder waiting for edit for a long time. So there we go for the disassembly. I hope you enjoyed that, and pop back and see us for the reassembly, and we will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.